In this section, we're going to look at measurement conversions. Now, by the end of this lesson, we're just going to talk a little bit. I want to discuss the origins of the imperial and the metric system. So a little bit of history. I think it's actually really interesting, and sometimes it helps us understand why we have to be conscious of conversions and why we have to learn two different units. And we're going to differentiate between the imperial and the metric system. So this won't take us very long. There's a few interesting things that come up. So I really like this. The yard. The yard was first defined as the gird or the circumference of a person's waist, or the distance from their nose to the end of their thumb. So if I was in class with you, oftentimes I'd hand out a pile of tape measures and I'd say, let's check from the tip of your nose to your thumb, how many of you are close to 36 inches. 36 inches is a yard. Or we might survey and see how many people have a 36-inch waist. That's where the old yard came from. Now, if we were in a large class setting, we would probably find that for the vast majority of individuals, especially in younger age groups, 36 inches is not the average waist size. I find the waist sizes are usually a little bit smaller, although the measurement from your nose to your fingertips is much closer. I think that probably has to do with ages and things like that, whereas your height has kind of been established by the time you hit that 20-ish mark, so the length of your arms is probably relatively consistent. Now, why is the yard 36 inches? Well, one of the reasons is because when we think about measurement, it was always defined by the royals or by the elite. So a yard was the waist circumference of a wealthy, well-fed, rich white guy. So that's why that number happens to come into play. And you'll find all of the standards typically will relate to sizes for Caucasians. So people of European descent. So there's a lot of kind of maybe a little bit of systemic racism that actually comes in when we think about where our measurement systems come from. But I find that measurement from your nose to your fingertip, I can't put it out on the screen all the way. From your nose to your fingertip is a really good one, and I actually use that myself all the time when I'm estimating yards. If I turn my head and I can get a little extra length, that gives me closer to a meter. But I'll often use that when I'm estimating quantities of whether it's fabric or rope or something like that. So it can be a convenient little measurement to have, but it just helps give you that visual frame of reference for what does a yard look like. Now the foot, where did the foot come from? Well, the foot literally came from feet. So in 1498, this guy, Jacob Kobel, wrote a book called Geometry. And in his book, he says, you stand at the door of a church on Sunday and bid 16 men to stop, tall ones, small ones. So he's trying to get things random as they happen to pass out when the service is finished. Then have them put their left feet one behind the other, and thus obtained shall be the right and lawful rod to measure and survey the land with, and the 16th part of it shall be the right and lawful foot. So we take 16 people, line them up, and you'd measure their feet length. Now, unfortunately, it says the first 16 people to stop as they come out of the church. Well, typically, guess who would have gone first? It would have been your elite. Notice the other thing says it would also be just men. We didn't include women. So the average foot length of an American male is about 10 3/4 inches, not quite the 12-inch foot that we have. But part of that comes from these wealthy guys would have all had shoes on, so that would have made their feet a little bit larger than what should have been. And the other thing to take into consideration is they didn't include any women in their sample. It was only the foot length of men, because men were the ones that dealt with commerce. So that made our foot a little bit larger than really it should be. So I would say 12 inches is not the average length of a man's foot. We've got documentation to prove that. I can't remember where I took that statistic from. Sorry, I didn't reference it. But if they had have included women, our foot length might have been closer to, say, 10 inches, maybe even 9 inches, so somewhere in there. So again, we have probably a little bit of got some interesting social stuff going on when you think about where our measurement systems come from, because again, we've got wealthy, rich white guys who can afford shoes that define the length of the foot. Now, so it's always kind of been the rich, the elite, that define all the measurement lengths, but they had some issues with that because every time maybe a king died, or as people change, maybe shoe styles change, the length of the foot changes. So what they did was they came up with a standard. And these were the standards for, and they would post them in the city center for what the standards happened to be. Now this is the standards for some imperial measures. A British yard, we've got 2 feet, 1 foot, and then there's some of these other ones. There's the inch, looks like it might be 6 inches, but they have rods and they have a whole bunch of weird measurements that we don't even use today that used to be used. Now, the metric system was adopted, or it was first described in the 1600s. It surprisingly took a very long time for it to be adopted globally, and part of that was people were very used to using the imperial system, and education wasn't widely available, so it was difficult to teach people a new measurement system. I would argue that there are still parts of the world where we have difficulty teaching a new measurement system. So in 1668, they first described the metric system, and in 1799, France said it's our official measurement. So they were the first country to become metric. But if you know anything about the history between the English and the French, they were always at war, in particular back in those periods. Kind of made up once we get to First and Second World War. But up until that point, they were not allies, they were enemies. And if the French are going to adopt it, the English, no way, they won't. Okay, this is paraphrased history. If there's any of you guys that are history buffs, forgive me. I'm paraphrasing slightly. But so in 1824, the British, they established the British imperial system, which meant feet and inches were redefined. They got rid of some of the old units that nobody used anymore. So thankfully for us, it's much easier. We don't have to deal with rods. You might hear furlongs talked about if you're talking about horses, but we really don't talk about a furlong anymore in everyday language. At that time, they changed the size of the gallon. So if you're wondering why there's 2 different gallon sizes, the British changed the size of the gallon in 1824, 1878. Now, prior to that time, the US had split from Britain, and the US was no longer part of Britain, which means, good old stubborn Americans, if there's any of you listening to this, I apologize, but they weren't going to accept the British definitions of these new imperial units. So to this day, there is an imperial gallon and there's a US gallon. And there is a difference between the two. One's a little over 4 liters and the other one is 3.79 liters. So 3.785, sorry. So there's a little bit of variation between the two, but you multiply that variation out over, you know, the capacity of a plane to hold fuel, it's a very substantial difference. Now for our calculations, we're going to deal completely with the US gallon because it's the one that's used the most common. We see the US gallon used even in Canada, even though we're part of a British colony, we would see our gallons typically defined as a US gallon, but it's good to be aware that too, in case you're in a situation where you're told a gallon and you don't know which kind it is. Now there's a physicist, James Maxwell, he really pushed for adopting the metric system because the metric system allowed them to use, it allowed way less conversions for things like physics, and that's why a physicist was so interested in it, or scientist. And I come from a science background, so I found it really interesting the way they did the shift. And it was in 1965, so we're talking between when it was first introduced to when it's finally adopted, almost 300 years later. The metric system was finally adopted as the measurement system of choice It was adopted globally except for 3 countries. There's Liberia, the US, and one other country that I can't remember that are still formally use the old imperial system. Now, what does that all mean? Well, until the USA gets on board and actually uses the metric system for more than just science, we have to learn both. So we'll blame the Americans for why we need to learn to use both systems. Although in Canada, the metric system is our official unit of measure, and if you were working for the province doing anything, you will find we use the metric system. More and more cars are coming with specs in the metric units. And if you're working in the wind turbine industry, because they're made in Europe the metric system is used very widely. You will see lots of metric units there. Unfortunately, in things like carpentry, we don't see the metric system used as much. We're still using the imperial. So we do have to learn both of them. Do you ever think the US will adopt the metric system as a primary system of measurement? There's a few states where legally it is their first, by law, what's written in the books, it is their system of measurement, but it's not used, it's not enforced. And how do you think that would impact your trade? I've popped the discussion box up. Drop in a comment. Let me know what you think. If you add something that looks like you thought about it, there may be a bonus mark in that for you. And we'll just take really quickly, we'll take just a really quick look at a conversion chart. This is one of the charts you may see. I've been editing it a little bit, so there might be a couple of things that get added for you. So we have a list of common imperial units here. So for length, we're going to see things like mile, yard, feet, inches. We've got multiple different units. Mass, you'll see tons, pounds. We won't use ounces very much, but you may see ounces occasionally. I've been shipping a lot of mail lately, and my scale always gives me pounds and ounces, so I have to turn it into decimal versions. Volume, we'll see gallons. You won't see pints and ounces as much, but I have a feeling there's a number of you that might be quite familiar with pints, quarts, and ounces. So we'll see a little bit of those units. The gallon we still do use, so we will look at the gallon. Now, a metric system, we're going to see things like, well, there's a multiple different units we could use. We'll see meters, we'll see grams, we'll see volts, ohms, watts, amps. There's a lot of different units that we can use with the metric system. And the keys that we're going to look for is terms like mega, killi, centi, milli, and micro that go in front of those units that change their size, but the base stays the same. We will also look at the metric ton, which is different than the imperial ton. We'll see a little bit of that pop in. You may not see that until you get a review practice. I won't practice every single unit conversion that you could see, just simply because once you know how to use the chart, you can use it to do any kind of conversion. So we'll try to give you a broad sample, but you may not see all of them.